Washington Journal continues.
Stephen Moore joins us to talk about the U.S. economy. He is a member of the Wall Street Journal editorial board and an author. We'll get to some of his books and stuff a little bit later on. But first I want to get your assessment of the Obama budget, President Obama's budget so far, and what should Congress be doing with that budget when they return next week?
Well, good morning, Rob. It's great to be with you. I'm aghast, actually, at this budget. I've been at this game now for 25 years following presidential budgets and dealing with tax and fiscal policy. You know, the debt that is embedded in this budget is just so enormous. When I first came to Washington and was working for Ronald Reagan, we introduced the first $1 trillion budget back in 1986. Now this year we're going to be borrowing $2 trillion. And this isn't just Barack Obama's fault, obviously. George Bush gave him a big fiscal hole to fill. But we're talking about $10 trillion of new debt over the next 10 years. And I just very much worry about what impact that's going to have on our ability to grow the economy and on the finances of our children and grandchildren and their children, because it could take 50 to 60 years to pay off all of this debt.
What responsibility does Congress have in this process?
Well, a big one, and of course Congress loves to spend money, and when Barack Obama gives Congress a green light to spend, as he has, they certainly are up to the challenge. We've seen this budget grow so enormously in just the last 8 or 9 years. When George Bush was elected president, the federal budget was $1.9 trillion. This year, it's going to be over $4 trillion. So in 9 years, we've more than doubled our federal budget. And we're just looking at enormous increases all over the board. And my central disagreement with the direction we're going in is just exactly the opposite of what Ronald Reagan did in the early 1980s to get us out of the greatest crisis we had had since the Great Depression back in the late 70s and early 80s, when we had very high inflation and high interest rates. And Reagan cut taxes and cut spending, and now we're raising taxes and raising spending, which I think is the wrong direction.
The op-ed, one of the op-eds in this morning's Wall Street Journal is by Ari Fleischer. He writes, everyone should pay income taxes. And he says, among other things, that Congress should start by refusing to go along with Mr. Obama's promises to cut taxes for 95% of the country. With the government running almost a $2 trillion deficit, no one should have their taxes cut. No one. Given the size of the deficit, fiscal responsibility demands nothing less. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm of two minds on this, and I know Ari, and I'm good friends with him. On the one hand, I agree with him that, you know, we're a democracy, and I think everybody should pay taxes. If you're going to vote, you should, and determine how the tax dollars are spent, then you should pay into the system. And Ari is exactly right. One of the things that's happened with our income tax system over the last 25 years or so is it's become more and more steeply progressive, in the sense that the richest 1 and 5% are paying a bigger and bigger share of the tax. So the top 1% used to pay 20% of the income tax. Now they pay 41% of the income tax. Meanwhile, at the bottom end, which is what Ari's talking about, you know, the people, all Americans with an income less than the median, so the bottom 50%, are not only paying 3% of the income tax, so 50% only pay 3%, and 35%, Rob, pay no income tax at all. And I think that's the problem that Ari's talking about, is that more and more Americans are not part of the income tax system at all.
Let me show you a little bit more of what he had to write. He says it's time to create an economic growth code whose purpose is to fix and grow the economy, not redistribute massive amounts of wealth. A new tax code that creates growth and reforms our entitlement system is the only way to dig our way out of the hole we're in.
Yeah, I could not agree more. Look, the problem I have with all our policies in Washington for the last 18 months or so is I don't think that we're serious in this country about economic competitiveness. We are living in a global economy. We're competing against the Chinese and the India. We're competing against Germany and France and Europe. And our policies are not oriented towards bringing production and manufacturing here in the United States. Ari's exactly right. We're doing all the wrong things now with our tax code. We're raising tax rates. Our corporate tax rate today, Rob, is 10 percentage points above the average for the rest of the industrialized world. That's not going to lead companies to come here. It's going to lead companies leaving here. So I think Ari's exactly right. We should be serious about using the tax code to promote growth, which is why, by the way, I really love that old Steve Forbes idea of the flat tax system. You know, 19%, everybody pays 19%, get rid of the deductions. It's a pro-growth code, but also I'm sure some of your callers are going to ask about this. I like the fair tax idea too, of just eliminating the income tax and paying your tax at the cash register when you buy things.
We're going to continue our discussion of the U.S. economy with Stephen Moore. We've got callers already heating up on this. The numbers are on the screen, 202-737-0001 for Republicans, Democrats 202-737-0002, Independents 202-628-0205, and you can always send us an email. The address is journal@cspan.org. Our first call comes from Robert in Atlanta on our line for Democrats. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to make a brief comment about what you just said, the flat tax. My wife was disabled. I could not get health insurance, and my medical bills were $35,000 a year just in medication. That was besides the Social Security disability that she got. I had to pay out of pocket that amount. In a flat tax, I wouldn't have been able to write that off. But that ain't the reason I'm calling. Go back to the 60s and 70s, I understand that the average CEO is making approximately 35 times what the average employee makes here in the United States. And today, that's about the same figures as you'll find in Europe. But now, I'll bet your guests will admit that we've heard figures of somewhere in the range of 300 to 400 times what the average employee makes here. Now, you don't want there to be a higher tax on those folks? I like that comment.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm sorry to hear about your family's medical problems. I would say this, I think one of the reasons that health care is so expensive in this country, one of the reasons is that we have very high quality of care, but the other reason is that that health care is tax deductible, and that leads to rising costs. I actually think if we got rid of the tax deductibility of health care, the system would run much more smoothly. People would be much more efficient in terms of the way they spend health care, and I bet that the cost of your health care would be lower under a system where we had a flat tax than the one now. And by the way, your earnings would be higher. You'd be able to keep more of your after-tax earnings. With respect to the rich, look, my feeling is we ought to have a tax system that tries to make poor people rich, not a system that makes rich people poor. And I think a lot of our politicians forget that all the time. Let's not forget that when Ronald Reagan cut tax rates in 1981 from 70% down to 28%, we saw an increase in incomes across the board. Lower income people saw gains, middle income people saw gains, and rich people saw gains. I don't have a problem with paying CEOs a lot of money if they're running multi-billion-dollar companies and they make a profit. I think what I and a lot of Americans object to is paying CEOs a lot of money and bonuses when those companies lose money. And that was, of course, the big controversy we had over AIG. Those bonuses were just reprehensible when these companies were losing tens of billions of dollars